Hi, preview staffers. Welcome to the placement mini modules. This is the first of 4 modules that I'm putting together that's going to cover all of the placement topics and go more in depth into what Nigel covered with you on Tuesday of this week during the initial placement training. Keep in mind that we are going to do a placement review in class in a week and a half. So as you're going through the modules, write down any questions that you have and make sure you bring those with you when Nigel's in class again in a couple, in like 2 weeks, I think it is. So keep in mind that this is one of the most difficult topics that we cover. Placement is incredibly challenging because there's so many nuances and intricacies as to how it's evaluated and how it affects the students. So take your time with it. If it gets confusing or frustrating, just like I said, watch the module, write down your questions, and we'll make sure we'll cover it lots and lots more times to make sure that you get it as we head into the end of the semester. So without further ado, let's begin. A little bit of a recap of what you guys covered in class with Nigel. Placement, remember, is a predictor of success. And I like to kind of hit this again because it's important to make sure that students understand that there is still effort involved with where students place. It's not a guarantee that they're going to be successful in that coursework. They still have to put in that time and effort like you would for any class. So just making sure that students aren't resting on their laurels if they're just going into a class that they placed into, but understanding that there's still going to be work and effort involved in the class that they have to take. And keep in mind that if they're uncertain about the class's difficulty, if they're thinking, well, maybe I'm okay to jump ahead, or maybe I'm, should be concerned and I have to go back a step or two, obviously that's going to be their choice as long as they have the scores that they need. But definitely encourage them to do extra research into the class's difficulty levels on their own after preview. So, for example, if a student's concerned about math or calculus, I do know that like the Teaching Center and I think the math department's website maybe as well will post old exams. So students can go in and maybe take the exams of, let's say, like the class below where they place to make sure that they have that information covered. And that way maybe help them feel a little bit more comfortable going into the class or where they place, or possibly going back a step if they're not really remembering that material or finding that it's a little bit more challenging at UF than what they may have done previously at prior institutions. Another friendly reminder, placement does not equal credit. They took a test, and not the same thing as taking like AP, IB, or ACE, where they actually are taking a test based off of a class that they completed. But this is just like I'm just sitting down and doing this test, whether it's the ALEX exam or whether it's FLATS, which is for foreign language placement, which we'll get to, not to worry. But there's not a lot of effort necessarily going into this, so they're not going to get any credit for it. Placement is just placement. It's just helping them figure out where they start within a sequence, um, and that's it. Now, you may have talked about some of this with Nigel earlier this week, but I do want to cover it again just to really make sure that we're hitting it home. Your words matter. Students are going to approach placement in a lot of different ways, and they're going to say a lot of different things. It's up to you to be really mindful and pay attention to what they're saying and how they're saying it, and making sure that you do not perpetuate any sort of negative stereotypes about where a score might be for a student, and making them feel marginalized or less than based on whatever it is that they're wherever it is that they're starting. So for example, I think the one that I most commonly see is that when students take ALEX, if they score in maybe the low 30s or anywhere below maybe even a 50%, a lot of times students will use the language, I failed placement. That's not true. This is just where they start. That's okay. It's not a big deal that they are, even though it might feel that way, it's not indicative of their ability to be successful in any particular major or in math or chemistry. It's simply just where they're starting, and that's, like I said, that's okay. So it's really important to make sure that you are perpetuating that idea and correcting their language if they're using it, and making sure that you're not using it yourselves. And that takes a lot of effort and work to really be that reflective and think about what you're saying and how you're saying it, because it's just really easy to fall into that pattern. Because your reactions carry weight. You know, you're that port in the storm, if you will, for the students. They're looking to you for guidance and understanding. So it's really important that you are approaching this professionally and that you're controlling your face. And so even if the student is being self-deprecating, let's say, and going, yeah, well, I failed placement, it's still important for you to make sure that you're correcting them and letting them know that that's not true, and that they are starting where they need to, and that's okay, and that just means that they're going to be hopefully successful their first semester because they're where they need to be, and that's all right. You have so much power as a preview staffer, and we've talked about this many times. So please make sure that you're using that power for good, if you will, and not for evil. That would be bad. This is always something I think that can be very confusing, and that's fair because it almost seems counterintuitive to how we approach this concept of UF credit always superseding incoming credit. If a student takes the class here and everything, that always matters more. But placement isn't quite the same with that. So it's important to recognize this. Placement does not supersede incoming credit. So for example, if a student, let's say, is a math major and they take the ALEX exam and they earn a 71%, that means that they're going to place into Mac 1147 or pre-calculus. Because that 50 to 74% on that chart places them into Mac 1147. And we know Mac 1147 is the right course because the student's a math major, right? We know that that's the actual trajectory of trying to get into Mac 2311 that we're looking for. So Mac 1147 is where the student places in this scenario. But let's say the student has incoming credit, and it's confirmed, for Mac 2311, Calc 1 through AP. Everything might tell us, well, okay, but we have to go with the ALEX exam, right? Because that's UF specific. That's not the case. Like it says at the very top, the placement score is not going to supersede incoming credit. In this situation, the student has credit for Mac 2311, which means the student is eligible to retake Mac 2311 if they want to, regardless of the 71%. Or they can move into Mac 2312, Calculus 2, because again, they meet that prerequisite. So as much as it might seem odd to maybe go with it that way, it's really important that you're not negating the student's incoming credit and pushing it aside for their ALEX score. Sometimes we want to use them in conjunction with each other and help maybe make a tailored recommendation for the student. But really important that you understand that we're not taking away the credits that the students have earned coming in. Otherwise, they would be very upset. The state would be upset. It would just be a big thing. We obviously can't nullify incoming credit and say that it's not something we can use to examine where a student is going to start at UF. So just to keep that in mind. This is also something I know that you talked about in class earlier in the week, but I do want to emphasize it again. There's a difference between what a student can take and what we recommend the student take, right? So in that previous scenario that I just discussed about the math major, let's actually change the ALEX exam to maybe a 55% or something like that. And the student, let's say, got a 3 on AP Calculus, but feels really uncertain about whether or not they are confident in their calculus skills. That's a situation where, I mean, with a student, I would probably explore different options. Now, can they take Mac 2311 again or go into Mac 2312? Yes, they can. But my recommendation would be at the very most to retake Calc 1 before moving into Calculus 2, right? So it just depends on the student, depends on what the circumstances are, but making sure that you are approaching everything with both of those pieces in mind, because we don't want to tell a student they can't do something when they can, but we also don't want to just ignore a recommendation piece of that conversation either, because that's really important to make sure we're helping students make good decisions for themselves moving into their first semester. Just so that you can see, this is what is going to look like for a student who needs to schedule adjust after preview. And the reason I'm bringing this up in placement is because placement is a really big reason as to why we do a lot of schedule adjusting issues. after preview ends. So you'll see that there's two different options or two different paths, if you will, that a student can take if they are looking to schedule adjust after their preview session. And this is in the preview workbook. I actually pulled this picture directly from there, so you can always take a look at it in the workbook, or make sure that you're referring students to this. But you'll see that the first option is if a student wants to, let's say, take a different elective or gen ed, or after they weren't able to take IDS 1161 or one of the Quest courses, and they really want to make sure that they take that right away. Any of those reasons, those are perfectly valid reasons to change the schedule, but they're going to do that on their own when registration opens up for them again in August. Okay, that's not going to be something where they're going to actually reach out to us through Preview Adjust and request that we do it for them, because those are things that don't have to happen. They're just things that students want to happen, and that's something that they can take care of on their own. Now, if a student, let's say after preview, they email you or they're thinking about it as they leave and you want to make sure you're referencing them to this. If the student's thinking about, if they change their major and they all of a sudden are pursuing a totally different path, or if they have new placement information, maybe they didn't take ALEKS before they came to preview and now they have, or if their AP IB ACE credits that they predicted were not correct, and so something needs to change on their schedule because they made a decision about a class based on what their predictions were, that's when you would refer the student to email the Preview Adjust email, as you can see in that bottom middle second box on the bottom row. That's when you would refer the student to that email, and then we can actually help them from there to adjust their schedule before the registration period opens up, because those are legitimate requests. So it's just really important to understand which one you're referring the student to based on maybe what their concerns are as they're wrapping up preview and finishing up their schedule before they head home on day 2. All right, now that we've covered the placement basic review, let's jump into placement for English. ENC 1101. That's really the main focus of our placement review for English. The big thing with this, and I know that Nigel covered this, but I am hitting all the points once again, is that if you have credit for ENC 1101, you cannot retake it. And I know that flies in the face of kind of a lot of the other things that we talk about, especially, the example I just gave where a student can retake Calculus 1, right? And maybe that's the best thing for them. In many situations, a student can retake a class. I don't necessarily recommend it for certain classes, like in the social sciences, like a political science class, or potentially for like humanities, like history or something. It's a little bit more unnecessary because of the nature of the sequential building of classes that you find in math and science, which makes it more likely to be helpful from a foundational standpoint. But for English, it's a little bit different. ENC 1101, the rule is if you have credit for it, you cannot retake it. The other rule is that if a student has a high enough verbal, ACT and or SAT score, that's going to place the student out of ENC 1101 and they are ineligible to take it as well. So it's really important if a student, let's say, tries to register for ENC 1101 and it doesn't let them, that you are making sure to check that first, because that's probably the reason it's not going to let them register for the class. But also, just to help negate that being an issue on day 2, pay attention to this on the top of their preview prep sheet, which I'll show you an example of in a moment, so that you are helping the student find backup courses if they really do want to take a composition class their first semester. And we're not just like falling into ENC 1101 and then find out, just kidding, now you have to do all this other extra work to figure out what class to take in the middle of their registration time. This is what it looks like in the preview workbook for English placement, just to kind of make sure students understand what we're talking about. So as you can see, it says a 640 or lower, that's the SAT. I don't know why there should probably be headers. We might need to fix that. But anyway, that's SAT, and then the 0 through 28, or rather 29 or higher, is for ACT verbal. For those two pieces, that's when a student would place out of ENC 1101 and then would need to take any other gen ed composition class beyond ENC 1101 to meet the gen ed composition requirement. Keep in mind, and this is just, again, a callback to what we just talked about, placement does not give credit. So if a student, let's say, has a 29 on the verbal ACT, yes, they cannot take ENC 1101, they place out of it, but it's not like they all of a sudden now have 3 hours of gen ed composition, right? They still have their 6 hours of gen ed composition. They just have to start at a little bit of a higher level. So where do you find the student's ACT, SAT scores? As I said a few slides ago, that's going to be on the preview prep sheet. It's going to post at the top of it, and it's automatically added to the prep sheet. So even if the student doesn't complete preview prep, if they haven't input any information, and most students will, keep in mind that it's about 85 to 90% of our students, I think, that complete preview prep. Some more thoroughly than others, but either way, they're doing it. But all of our students, you're going to get a prep sheet for every single student that you have on the top of the prep sheet because it's reported to UF for admission reasons. That data is already there, so it's not self-reported, and it will be there for you to be able to use to determine placement for English. So here's an example of what it looks like, and as you can see up at the top, this is a preview prep sheet, and up at the top it gives you, if the student took ALEKS, it shows you the SAT verbal or math, and the ACT verbal math. In this case, the student has an ACT verbal of 24. And so for that, because we know that they would need a 29 or higher to place out of ENC 1101, the student wouldn't place out based on their ACT verbal levels. However, if we are paying attention to the rest of the preview prep sheet, you'll notice that the student is bringing in ACE credit for ENC 1101, so they already have credit for the class, so even if they wanted to retake it, they would not be eligible to do so because they already have credit for it. So we are looking at both options, but for the placement piece of it, they do not test out of ENC 1101 with their verbal score. So the timeline, does a student have to take ENC 1101 his or her first term? Well, you guys think about that for a second and determine if you think that's the case. And the answer is no, not necessarily. It could be required or recommended for tracking. We do want to be mindful of that. Some majors do have ENC 1101 or 1102 very early in their tracking. College of Public Health and Health Professions for one, possibly the College of Journalism and Communications, depending on the track, I think, and the major. But there are some that have it very early on for the students. So it could be something that we really strongly encourage that they take early, but it's probably not going to be required for anyone. But we do, like I said, strongly recommend that students take it sometime during the first year, preferably in the fall if available. And the reasoning for that is because students really need strong writing skills in a variety of classes, no matter what the major. So having that right from the very beginning, because as you already know as students here, you're going to write in social behavioral sciences. You're going to write in humanities classes. It's not just composition or words courses where you're going to actually have to write. So starting that skill development right from the very beginning is very helpful because you're not going to be able to avoid all of those classes right from the top, right when you start at UF. So just something to keep in mind when you're working with students. So not every student is going to be able to take ENC 1101 or another composition class their first term just because of the availability. But if it's available and they're open to it, then I definitely would encourage it. However, when would I not recommend a student take ENC 1101 or really any other GEC course, let's say during summer B, for example? And my recommendation for them not doing it would be if, let's say, they maybe had a quote-unquote lower ACT, SAT verbal score. So if it was something that was kind of implying that maybe that wasn't their strong suit, and I would probably ask them about it and say, how do they feel about English or composition or writing first before making any assumptions. But if the student shares that they're worried about it, they're worried about composition classes or writing, really any class, if a student indicates they're worried about it, is something that I would probably not encourage them to take during summer B, because that's a 6-week accelerated term, right? That can be very challenging. So why put them in a situation where, one, they're not excited about it to begin with, while they're transitioning to UF doesn't seem like the best plan, but then also in an accelerated format, that just seems like a lot. Another reason would be if the student doesn't need any more gen ed composition or they don't want to take any, then of course it's not necessary for them to take it. And then if the student's already taking 6,000 word course in summer B, I probably wouldn't then have them do 12,000 words. That's a lot to handle really for anybody. I wouldn't have them do it probably in a fall or a spring, but definitely not in summer B. So just paying attention to all the different nuances and pieces of the puzzle when you're helping the student build a schedule can help you really make sure that they're feeling comfortable about the classes that they're selecting. Now, another thing that's really helpful and important, and this is really higher level advising because this is looking ahead, which we did in a couple, or at least one of the academic labs, for those of you who are there and remember, the importance of looking ahead to later tracking or semester plan scheduling, because it can influence how you advise a student for their first term. And the reason I bring this up here is because all of the colleges that are listed have specific composition requirements for their majors, whether through tracking or just through major or college requirements. For example, the College of Engineering requires that all students in their majors complete professional communications for engineers. Now, that's not a freshman appropriate class. It's not something that we would recommend a student take their first semester. So if a student comes to you and, let's say, already has credit for ENC 1101, but wants to take a composition class in their first semester at UF, which, again, that makes sense, right? But they're saying things like that phrase that I hate, which that I hate, which is, I just want to get it out of the way. First of all, hopefully we're talking with them as you shared with me what you would say in one of your homeworks. Hopefully we're talking with that student about why that might not be the best attitude to have, or let's find something that they're interested in so that they will maybe have a more successful transition because they're passionate about the material. But putting that aside, let's say they're very adamant about taking another composition class in their first semester. One of the things that's very helpful to maybe, or rather just to help them plan ahead, is to say, well, okay, you're thinking strongly about engineering major. You're going to have to take this other composition class in the future anyway. So sure, you could take a composition class right now if you want, but you're not going to need that because you're going to actually finish your composition with a required course maybe next semester or sophomore year or somewhere in the future. And that's the case for any of the colleges that are listed here. So sometimes it is helpful to know and look ahead to see what's there in order to make sure the student's not taking something that they don't really want to take, and then might come back and be like, man, why did I do this? We don't want them to have that regret, because it's important to see the big picture. So are there any gen ed composition classes that are not freshman appropriate? And the answer is yes, of course there are. There are not appropriate, or they're not freshman appropriate classes in any of the gen ed categories, because some of them are just too high a level or just cover content that isn't freshman friendly, if you will. But the most common options that we see at Preview in regards to composition are going to be the following 5 classes. So professional writing in business, professional writing in the discipline, professional communication for engineers, which we just talked about, writing in the health professions, and writing in the law. We do not recommend, nor do the departments say that these classes are freshman appropriate for our students. They're not listed in the Preview workbook as options for the students to take. Though that doesn't mean that they might not find their way to them if they're doing gen ed composition searches and there's seats available, or if they're looking on the websites or in the semester plans, you might find them there. So students may ask you about them. It's just really important to steer them towards either freshman appropriate classes, or if they're really adamant about taking these instead, is having them wait to a different term. We don't save seats in these classes, so the chances of them finding an open seat is also very small, which is another reason why we don't necessarily want to spend too much time focusing on these when working with our students. And we all recognize that this is a lot to learn and remember. And keep in mind that the Preview workbook is going to have a list of freshman appropriate classes, like I just said, that's going to really help guide you with what is and is not okay for students to take. So if you're ever not sure and you're like, oh, back in my head, I feel like there's a class that Rachel talked about that students shouldn't take. Is this the one? Look in the Preview workbook and see if it's there. If it's not, then it's safe to say that it's not freshman appropriate, okay? And that we would discourage a student from taking it. So our final piece of the English placement review, or in-depth module, is going to be just a quick review of gen ed composition and words, because I do know that this can sometimes still get confusing. So keep in mind that when we say GEC, we're talking about gen ed composition. So one of the gen ed categories that a student has to complete to be able to meet their 36 hours of gen ed coursework. Students are required to do 6 hours of gen ed composition, and all gen ed composition classes are going to give the student 6,000 words. So no matter what composition class the student takes at UF, they are going to get 6,000 words for it. But the alternative is that not all writing courses are composition. So for example, what I mean by that is WR, which is the code that we use very obviously because it's just the acronym, writing requirement is something that you're going to see in the Preview workbook, and also all over, in the schedule of courses and the registration system. The writing requirement says that students have to complete 24,000 words in order to graduate. So this is separate from genetic composition. Genetic composition is 6 hours requirement. Writing requirement is 24,000 words. Now, 12,000 of those words are going to be completed through the genetic composition classes, right? Because as we said, all genetic composition is 6,000 words. You have to do 6 hours of genetic composition. Therefore, you're going to have 12,000 words completed through that requirement alone, overlapping with the writing requirement. Okay, so 12,000 of the 24,000 will be met that way. And then 12,000 of the words can come from any other writing requirement class. So that might be additional genetic composition classes, that's fine. But it also could be from any other course that has a writing requirement designation. And you're going to find those classes all over the place. You know, try searching in the schedule of courses sometime and see all the classes that come up. So it's just, I wanted to remind everybody about the difference between those two components and how they interact with each other, if you will, but that they are two different pieces and requirements for the students to do. And I believe that ends our first module. I'll see you on the flip side in module 2.